Good morning and welcome to Hudson Institute's panel on India and its electoral achievements over the last 7 decades. At a time when the world over democracies and democratic norms are facing both domestic and international challenges, India has long remained unique, a post-colonial country that remained a democracy with strong political institutions, civilian supremacy, and overall vibrant economy and society. Starting from 1952, when independent India held its first elections with 176 million eligible voters, the country has built an impressive electoral machinery that helps conduct elections at local, state, and federal levels. In the 2019 parliamentary elections, there were 900 million registered voters, 1 million polling stations, 10 million electoral officials, and over 8,000 candidates. How has India managed to do this, and what are some of the lessons learned over the years? To discuss this, we are fortunate to have with us an amazing panel. I will start off by briefly introducing all our panelists, all of whom are well-known people. Mr. N. Gopalaswami served as the 15th Chief Election Commissioner of India from 2006 to 2009. He spent 4 decades in the Indian Administrative Service and was also for a Home Secretary, Government of India. Dr. Daniel Twining is President of the International Republican Institute since September 2017, where he leads the Institute's mission to advance democracy and freedom around the world. Dr. Sandeep Shastri is a political scientist who's Vice Chancellor of the Jain University and National Coordinator of the Lok Niti Network. This event will be conducted as a moderated conversation. We have received questions and I will incorporate those into the questions I ask each panelist. Mr. Gopalaswami, I will start with you. As I mentioned, India is a rare post-colonial country that has consistently held free and fair elections for 7 decades and established electoral institutions, making it one of those countries where, to date, no political party or other entity has challenged the verdict of an election. In many countries across Asia and Africa, coups took place because one or the other group did not accept the electoral verdict. As former Chief Election Commissioner, I was hoping you could enlighten our viewers on how has India managed to accomplish this.
Okay, let me start with a few observations in the sense that, okay, part of it is because of the historical legacy, one could say, in the sense that there are mentions in ancient Indian literature about janapadas or small principalities self-governing. India has long been governed internally in the villages itself or in the groups of villages. The central authority was not running the entire show. That was the way things were. Apart from that, historically, what was mentioned in the ancient Indian literature, there is specific mention in some epigraphic evidence which we get around the 10th century and 9th century from a temple in near Kanchipuram. It's called Uttarameru. In the inscription, there is mention of an arrangement within a particular area of having the people select. It was not election; it was select people with qualifications, with certain educational qualifications. But it was very strongly, it was very interesting to note that it was very strongly mentioning about having no criminal record, one, and having paid all the taxes without fail, and so on. I mean, that was something which was incorporated in that epigraphic evidence, and that was in the Chola dynasty period. And it didn't seem to be an isolated case of one village doing it, but it seemed to be a general practice during the Chola regime itself. Cut back to forward to the British period, when things became totally centralized. I mean, the villages lost their ability to internally manage things, and it was all centrally managed with central officials, both at the district level as well as the state level, managing affairs. But if there is one factor which I could say led to what today is a proud moment for all of us, that elections are conducted fairly freely and acceptable to all the political parties. It goes back to the men and women who led the freedom struggle. Even as early as 1928, 20 years before we achieved independence, there was the report from Mr. Motilal Nehru, father of Jawaharlal Nehru, that we will go for a democratic setup. But the interesting thing there was that it was going to be franchise to all. I mean, it was universal adult franchise. And mind you, in 47, when we went for it, in 50, when the first elections took place, the adult literacy was 15%. The female literacy was around 7% or so. Despite this, tremendous, faith was placed on the common man and woman that they will be able to exercise their franchise and do the right thing for the country. And that continued for the next 14, 15 years, or a little even more than that, with Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru being the helm of the affairs. And he was a very committed his democratic credentials, and therefore one could easily say that with the popularity he enjoyed, with the power he had as Prime Minister, unquestioned power, possibly he could have, if he wanted to, he could have become a dictator. But that was against the grain of his thinking, and ably supported by Sardar Patel and Rajaji and Radhakrishnan, Rajendra Prasad, and a galaxy of people who took part in the freedom struggle, and they were committed to democracy, and that leadership continued in the formative years of the republic, and therefore the foundation was well laid. Yes, thereafter certain deterioration took place, as it happens in the course of things, but again we were lucky. We were lucky in the sense that in 1990 we had a Chief Election Commissioner, Mr. T.N. Seshan, who came on the scene, and he brought back some of the sheen which was lost by the Election Commission. But going back to the provisions of the Constitution, this is very important. You see, the Constituent Assembly, when it discussed it, made it very clear that we will have an Election Commission which is an independent body. Therefore, the Election Commissioner, Chief Election Commissioner, who was the only person at that time, was to have the powers in the Constitution and incorporated in the Constitution itself. So Article 324 to 329 in the Constitution talk about the Election Commission, and the Chief Election Commissioner was given the status of a Supreme Court judge. So that was the way it was arranged. And mind you, he could not be removed excepting through a resolution passed by the Parliament for his impeachment. Okay, so the institution of the Election Commission was very strongly, the foundation very strongly laid, and that carried on. And in over time, of course, the Election Commission was performing its duties, but nobody really, had. I mean, it was not something which was in front of everybody's eyes until 1990, because of circumstances again. When over the time, when the deterioration, the politicians, the next generation politicians, the generation afterwards, slowly started using power as the main ingredient of their activities, and they were after the power point. T.N. Seshan came on the scene and transformed the entire scenario. But mind you, he never did anything which was outside the provision of the law. This is one. The law, of course, gave him a lot of powers. Article 324 talks about the Election Commission being the last word in conducting elections. Therefore, the plenary powers were with him. The Supreme Court, time and time again, Supreme Court and other high courts supported the Election Commission in a very, very strong way and strengthened the hands of the Election Commission. Therefore, the Election Commission could carry on its job without being interrupted by the courts. And the special provision I must mention here was Article 329, which talks about the courts not interfering during the course of an election proceedings. Therefore, the moment the election is called, to the time when the results are declared, the courts do not interfere. Anybody going to the court asking for interim stay, this and that, is never granted. And even if by mistake a High Court grants it, the Supreme Court immediately removes that stay and allows the Election Commission to complete. There are instances where Election Commission has made a mistake. Still, the Supreme Court said, no, we will not interfere until the action is over. And after that, they did interfere. They did set aside some elections, some activities, but they stuck to this one issue of not interfering during the course of the election, as otherwise it would have become extremely complicated issues with lawsuits and cross lawsuits and things like that. So Session used his powers and brought in some important changes. One, he introduced the system of observers being brought in. It was using his plenary powers, and he brought in observers to observe the election and report. He insisted that as per the Constitution and the law, which says that the staff will be granted or placed at the disposal of the Election Commission, that should be not only in mere spirit, but in letter also. That every staff member who is seconded to the Election Commission is directly under the control of the Election Commission during the course of the elections. Then he brought in, in order to curb the especially the bogus voting or voting by persons other than the voter, he brought in the electoral photo identity card, which was a great success, and it was initially resisted, but the Supreme Court came in to strongly support the Election Commission's move to ensure that a voter who comes to the voting booth is properly identified with an identity card. And thereafter, in 2009, during my time, we brought in not only the photo identity card, the photographs got printed in the electoral roll itself, so that when the elector comes into the polling booth, the official there can look at the photograph in the electoral roll, can look at the photograph with the person who's coming in as a voter, and therefore the possibilities of bogus voting had gone down considerably. He also made, TN Session also made a lot of efforts to ensure that the booth capturing or the vote stuffing and hijacking of the election booths were all very strongly handled and stopped. In fact, he used one provision which many people did not earlier use, many chief election commissioners. If he found anything was wrong, he resorted to one simple tactic of cancelling the election, and that sent shockwaves around. And I think it is after that the people came to realize that there is an election commission which has so much of powers, and therefore the election commission's own activities were started being very closely seen by the public. The public was aware of what is going on, therefore they were looking at the election commission doing the right thing, and that was a curb on the politicians misusing. And there is something which is unique to India, which also I will mention, that is called the Model Code of Conduct. Now, this is a document which talks about do's and don'ts, is applied to the political parties, but more so to the political party in power, so that it does not use its powers to its great advantage. And interestingly, this document was put together in the 1960s by the political parties themselves. It was started in Kerala, and thereafter it spread. By 1980s, the state governments, the committees in each state used to be used to be presided over by the chief ministers. But thereafter, they decided that they will hand over the whole thing to the Election Commission. Election Commission, especially during sessions time, refined the model code of conduct. The basic point there is that the government in office or the political party in office, once the election is called for, cannot announce special concessions to the voters to lure them, cannot use government machinery or government facilities like guest houses, rest houses, etc. for its own party's propaganda. They have to stand in queue like any other party. So the first come, first served rule was applied. And these are the ways in which Mrs. Seshan brought up a total relook at the way the elections were being organized. And thanks to that, and subsequently what happened was everybody who followed had to at least rise up to that level, if not do better than that. So that is something which put the entire thing in the correct path. Therefore, to start with, the very committed and totally democratically inclined leadership, and thereafter some innovation, some additional work done by the Election Commission under Mr. T.N. Seshan. But by and large, the political parties, barring some elements within each political party that happens, the leadership of the political parties is generally committed, and therefore they have been very restrained. Even if they have any grievance, it's all very restrained in expressing it. EVMs were brought in thanks to Mrs. Indira Gandhi. In fact, I am told by the old timers in the Election Commission that some of the members and some of the political advisors to Mrs. Indira Gandhi, they didn't want the electronic voting machine to be brought in, but she prevailed, and the electronic voting machine was approved by the Parliament for being brought in. Subsequently, of course, the voter verifiable paper trail has also been added to the electronic voting machine to strengthen its credentials. Therefore, the system, if it is today functioning well, it is thanks to the people, their sense of right and wrong. In fact, when they were so accustomed to democracy that when for 2 years the democracy was missing from the scene, they came back with a vengeance and voted a huge voting in 1977 elections, which totally turned the face of the thing. After that, I don't think anybody dares to postpone or cancel elections. So that is the history, and I personally feel that it is the political leadership, the public's strong sentiment towards, because they have expectations. They have expectations from the government, from the political representative. And one thing I have noticed all through is that a member of the public, if you ask him saying that you have a grievance, to whom will you go first? Invariably, the answer will be to my MLA or to the member of parliament or a member of legislative assembly. And very few will say that, I will go to the district authorities. They will first bank upon the local representative who's their own, is one of their own. That's how they see. And that is a very strong point for democracy. As long as the people believe in an elected representative, democracy is safe.
Thank you so much.
That's what.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gopalaswami. Dr. Shastri, I'd like to turn to you now. You're a political scientist. You're somebody who has studied India's elections over the decades. How has India managed? If you were somebody looking from the outside, how has India managed to involve these millions of voters, thousands of observers in a large, ethnically diverse, sort of population and across difficult and diverse terrains? You are muted, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Aparna, and thank you, Hudson Institute, for this opportunity. And it's indeed a unique privilege to share this webinar stage with Dr. Daniel and Gopalaswami ji. Aparna, to respond to the question you raised, I would quickly make 7 points, which are, I think, more like a footnote to what the former Chief Election Commissioner said, because he has covered the ground quite magnificently and quite succinctly. My point number one, I think the success of Indian elections is a byproduct of the fact that the election in India is a festival of Indian democracy. The Indian voter encounters an election every year. It could be a national election, it could be a state election, it could be a local election. Now, like the festivals of India, election is like a festival and one comes after the other. And in a sense, it's a celebration of democracy. Even the critics who say that India is only an electoral democracy, so be it. The fact of an electoral democracy makes that voter an empowered voter at the time of election. So I think the centrality of the election process, because of the fact of the election being so important in the process, is, I think, critical. My point number two, going back to what the former Chief Election Commissioner said, when the constitution makers took this decision to give every adult Indian citizen the right to vote, at that time it was 21, later reduced to 18, the then President of the Constituent Assembly and later the first President of India, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, called it an article of faith. This is the specific term he used, that the Constituent Assembly is expressing an article of faith in the Indian voter. Because many people believed with this high level of illiteracy, with this high levels of poverty, will this voter deliver democracy or will this voter derail democracy? And I think this article of faith has been lived up to, if you look at the high voter turnout that Indian elections have seen. And of course, high is a relative term in India. Even late 60% is considered okay, not very high. When it goes to 70s and 80s, it is called high. So I think we have to contextualize it to the country you are talking about. Thirdly, I would say something you referred to in the beginning. I think the success of Indian democracy has to be seen in terms of the scale of numbers. The sheer enormity of the process in India. You refer to the fact that in our last Lok Sabha elections, there were 900 million voters eligible. We had 4 million electronic voting machines used. And we had 2 million police personnel to help conduct the election. So these are the numbers we are talking about. I remember a former Chief Election Commissioner of India, who was referred to, Mr. Sheshan. Once when, I won't mention the name, once in a European country, he was asked, why is it that you are a hero in your country? In my country, the people don't even know the name of the person who conducts the election. Mr. Sheshan, in his typical style, looked at that journalist and asked her, what is the population of your country? That journalist fumbled to say a figure. And then Mr. Sheshan looked at that journalist and said, do you know the largest constituency for my Lok Sabha has more voters than what you just now referred to? And we have 543 constituencies. I thought that was a very fitting reply to somebody who did not understand the enormity of the process that you find in India. My point number 4. I think very critical to the success of the Indian election system is the role of the state machinery. I think right from day one, the Indian election culture has been not of the voter going to the process, but the process coming to the voter. You see? In the Indian election system, the government machinery comes down to your home multiple times to register you as a voter. You don't have to find your way anywhere. The government comes to your doorstep to register you as a voter. Our former CEC is here. He would correct me if I'm wrong. This process of managing the election is a continuous process. When an election is on, it is about conducting the election. When an election is not on, it's about updating the electoral rolls. It's about revising the electoral rolls. So that process never stops. That process is on. And I think the efficiency with which that process has gone on, I think, is the strength of the Indian election system. My point number 5, which the earlier speaker referred to tangentially, but I would come to straight away. I think the success of the Indian election system is because of the uniformity of electoral norms we have followed across the country. See, be it a state level election, be it a national level election, there are no differences across states in terms of procedures and processes. It is uniform across the country. And I think the Constituent Assembly, in its wisdom, took a very important decision that all national elections and all state level elections will be managed by a single body, the Election Commission of India. Now, you do have now a state election commission to manage local elections, but the Election Commission of India has the responsibility for the conduct of all state level and all national elections, and therefore they are able to bring in a process of uniformity across states, across the country, and you will not have a challenge of one process being followed in one state and another process being followed in another state. And I think this has been the strength of the Indian election system. Let me come to my point 5. I think the Constitution clearly talks of the Election Commission's mandate to conduct a free and fair election. And the Election Commission has taken this task extremely seriously of conducting a free and fair election. A reference was made to the code of conduct, which they strictly put into place. A reference was made to Mr. Sheshan's role of trying to put into practice, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gopalaswami sir, more than put into practice, put in public visibility certain processes which were already in place earlier, but did not have so much of visibility. Let's also remember the time Mr. Sheshan became the Chief Election Commissioner was also the time we started off in India with the 24/7 media. So there was this opportunity to be able to actually bring it out into the drawing rooms of everybody at that point of time. In this, I would add one more point, Dr. Aparna, which is we are living in an age of instant craze and everything to be done instantly. Our election commission and our election process does not believe in that. We believe that nothing needs to be done instantly. What's important is the purity of the process, the honesty in the process, the efficiency in the process. So Indians are perfectly okay with a 7-phase election. The 2019 election was a 7-phase election. The Indian election festival in 2019 spread over an entire 5 weeks from the 11th of April to the 17th of May. So it was in 7 phases spread across an entire month. And the Indian voter was not worried about that. We enjoyed that because the festival of Indian democracy went on for a month. But then more seriously, spreading it over 7 phases allowed us to protect, allowed us to ensure the sanctity of the process, and allowed us to ensure that every voter who wanted to go out and vote, she or he had that opportunity. You created what I would call a psychologically safe space to be able to go out and vote. There are aberrations, but that fact that you timed it out, you spaced it out, you recognize the fact that you are talking of so many numbers, and it's not that you start the voting in the morning and by evening you want the results out. Indians are quite okay with waiting for a day, waiting for 2 days for the results to come out, because we believe that that time frame taken to be able to count is a byproduct of efficiency, is a byproduct of an element of surety in the process. And that for me is the strength of the process. My last point I would like to make is you talked about diversity. I think the fact that the language of the state is the language that is used in the electoral process. Every state in India has its own official language, and it's that language which is mandated on your machines, in your processes. So for the Indian voter, the voting process is taking place in his or her own language, of course, along with the official languages which are declared in the country. So that makes it possible for so many different languages to be represented in the election process. Now, as somebody who does election surveys, we translate our questionnaires into 18 different languages, which is itself a Herculean task because we need to make sure that we are asking the same question in all the 18 languages. And this is not just done by surveyors like us. This is done by the election process, which makes sure that in each language, which is the language of the street, the language of the people of that particular state, you are actually following the processes required. Let me make one final point before I stop the commentary I was coming up with. And this last point relates to series of surveys we have done in the last 25 years, where we have asked common people as to how much do they trust government institutions. We normally ask for around 13 to 14 different institutions, and consistently, across surveys, the Election Commission would be among the top 2 or maximum top 3. The Election Commission is seen by common people as the one which plays a major role in the proper, effective, and fair conduct of elections. There are problems, which I'll come to in your second segment. But I think if I were to rate why is it that the Indian election system continues to have that faith which the citizen reposes in it, I think it's a combination of these 6 or 7 factors I just now outlined. I'll be happy to come back later to elaborate on any of these points.
Thank you, Dr. Shastri. I'll now turn to Dr. Daniel Twining. Dr. Twining, you've followed India for many years. You're the president of IRI, whose mission, amongst others, and quote, motivate people to engage in the political process. How do you, as somebody who's watched India for so long, watched India's electoral accomplishments from outside, how do you see it and what is it that stands out to you?
Thanks, Aparna. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and Dr. Shastri and Mr. Gopalaswami. India's elections are endlessly interesting. They're actually a lot more interesting than America's and American politics. So I'm very pleased to be on this topic with 2 such renowned experts as well as you. And I would like to say, I think your book is excellent. And I hope everybody watching this will read it and learn from it as I did. Look, a lot's been covered. I'll be brief. I think there are 4 things that really jump out at me around India's electoral accomplishments. The first has been mentioned. It's the supremacy of civilians in the Indian system, that so many countries, not just in South Asia, but so many developing countries succumbed to various forms of Praetorian politics, and that never happened in India. The centrality of civilian rule, the centrality of the Indian civil service as guardians of India's democratic institutions, I think is really striking just in comparative perspective to a non-Indian for sure. So that's 1. 2, I would mention, of course, India's federal structure. I mean, the United States has a federal structure, but of course, we are running our elections really in a bottom-up fashion, almost at the county level. I think there are 3,000 of them in the United States. India is running its elections in much more centralized fashion through the Election Commission. But it's worth pointing out just how India's federal structure creates this rolling process of elections. And I think the most interesting aspects of Indian politics in many regards are how the state level elections interact with politics at the center. So if you're an elections junkie, if you're a democracy junkie, India just has so much to offer. There's always something happening. Bihar just had its very significant elections. There's always another one to look forward to. And these are always very dynamic and fluid. So that's 2. 3, Aparna, I would mention, this is quite interesting because identity politics can be very harmful in a democracy. But I would argue just historically, I mean, I would never argue that sectarianism is is good for democratic practice. But actually, I'm not making that point. I think India is a positive example broadly and historically of how sort of caste-based, regionally based politics have actually been very inclusive in terms of bringing a lot of what would otherwise be marginalized communities into the political process. And we know that. I mean, it's very interesting in India. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to vote. This is the opposite of many, many countries. And it's partly because political parties have been very effective in mobilizing voters, including around caste, including around other identity issues. But that this is really broadly quite striking, the inclusivity of the Indian electoral system. And finally, four, I know we'll have more time to talk about this, or I hope we will. But I've been in many conversations with Indian friends over the years who argue, no, India doesn't project democracy in the world. You know, we're very focused on perfecting our own democracy. It's you Americans who want to go out and do this missionary work of supporting other countries. But in fact, I mean, as my colleagues know, India actually has been a leader through the Indian International Institute of Democracy and Election Management, IDEM, in sharing best practices with many, many countries, dozens of countries from Afghanistan to Burma, in Africa and elsewhere, on electoral best practices, on elections management, on civic education, on how a government should communicate around elections to citizens to encourage full participation. India really stands out in this regard, and Indians don't toot their own horn about this enough. But I think really through IDEM in particular, India is making a very substantial contribution to democratic development in many, many countries, and that's something to be celebrated.
Thank you so much, Dan. And actually, your question sort of, your answer leads me to the next question, the next segment. And I wanted to start off again with Mr. Gopalaswami, that you spoke about what the Election Commission has done inside India, the massive apparatus in conducting elections. But if you could sort of, you could also talk a little bit about the technical assistance, the EVAM that India provides to other countries, and sort of considering that we live in this day and age when India may not want to export democracy, but other countries may seek Indian assistance. How does India look at that? And, what are sort of maybe an example or two which you could provide our viewers on how India helps countries which seek technical assistance from India?
Well, first and foremost, of course, we are clear about one thing, that we will not recommend our EVM for the simple reason that we demonstrate it, then tell them saying that if you like it, you can directly order, we will never order for you. This is just to ensure that nobody then says that you sent your EVMs to meddle in our elections. I mean, this happens in all the nearby countries. In fact, Nepal used our EVMs, Bhutan used our EVMs. But in all cases, we were very clear. We demonstrated, we told them how it works. And thereafter, they said, you can place the order directly. You can check the machines. We can help you technically, but we will not order. We will not interfere in your this thing directly dealing with that. That's one small issue. But over the period of time, the last 10 years, this IEDM, which is EDM, which has been brought into force, it has been holding across the board training courses for various countries, whosoever is willing to join. This is one way. We do help if anybody is looking at the legal aspects of this thing. We do provide some advice, but we are very careful about what we say. I mean, we do give a broad understanding of how the thing can be done, but we never get into the nitty-gritty of what they need to do, because they have to do it with reference to their own country, their own circumstances, etc., etc. Therefore, there cannot be any uniformity in that respect. We have been having this Commonwealth group. More than that, now it is the SARC group of electoral commissioners. They do come together once in a year, discuss various common issues, and observers teams are sent by, if in any of these SARC countries there is an election, then observers from each of these SARC countries are invited, and they go around and look at the election procedures, look at processes, and give them their report. They're trying to help them out in doing things the better way. I mean, which is all across the board, whichever our country is willing to send. I have myself been to Sri Lanka once, Maldives once, and so on and so forth. So and this is a kind of help which is being given, but most of it is in training the field level workers and training the middle level officials. And that is how this help has been given. In some cases, maybe a certain amount of financial assistance is given for purchase of equipment, etc., etc. Never to any political party, never to any other outfit. To the Election Commission, if they need any help in procuring equipment, etc., etc. So that is how it is been visualized, has been seen. Yes, I do agree that there is tremendous potential in that area, and it can be expanded to many other countries. In fact, over the years, a lot of MOUs have been signed by the IIEDM and the Election Commission with many countries in Africa, elsewhere, etc., etc. And that, of course, some of it is doesn't get activated immediately, but many of them do take advantage of it by, especially in the training aspect of it, and that's how it has been there. I do agree that it can be upscaled, which I'm quite sure the Indian Election Commission will do.
Thank you, Mr. Gopalaswami. Dr. Shastri, I'd like to bring you into this and ask you one sort of, if you could talk a little bit about, you've spoken a lot about the achievements and what the Indian electoral process has done, Election Commission of India. If you could talk a little bit about on the challenges which you believe it faces, both in the past few years and in the coming years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Let me start the discussion of the challenges in the election process by looking at how did citizens perceive of the election process, drawing from our study done around the last Lok Sabha election. When we asked common people in 2019 that did you face in your constituency examples of rigging, intimidation, or anything which went against the legal processes which an election should have, the response was very interesting. More than 1/3 of the respondents said that malpractices, if any, have actually decreased over the years. Around 1/5, around 20% said it's been the same. Whatever were these skirmishes or irritations, there is nothing more or nothing less about it. Interestingly, close to 16% said we have never had problems with the election process. 1/6 said we never had problems with the election process, and just another 1/6, 15% said that the challenges have actually increased. So most voters, if you look at these percentages, something like 8 out of 10 feel either there have not been problems or the quantum of challenges have actually reduced. And if you could add another data point before I move forward, if you look at the younger voters, those below 35 years of age, those below 35 years of age are more likely to say, we have never experienced electoral malpractices. See, the older voters, when they were younger, possibly had seen some problems, but those in the less than 35 age group are more likely to say, we have never actually encountered problems. So I think this gives us a snapshot of how common citizens in India actually view the electoral process and the sanctity, in a sense, of the electoral process. Now, having said that, let me now come to identifying possibly certain challenges which the process faces. Gopalaswami sir was very clear in his first intervention and the second when he talked about the the way in which the Election Commission has maintained its integrity and independence. And that's been our strength. But let me also add that there are a lot of citizens and intellectuals who believe that that independence, that autonomy, that functioning without pressures perceived or actual from the establishment could actually reduce. I think in the last few years, there has been some criticism of the Election Commission not being, at least in terms of its projection, as independent, as vibrant as it was in the past. And I think this is something that would need to be addressed, at least in terms of the image, at least in terms of what is happening on the ground. A second challenge which I'd like to raise is the Election Commission has been extremely effective in dealing with the visible challenges in the election system. But some of us would argue those invisible challenges, those which cannot actually be directly seen, that the Election Commission, by its own admission, has not been able to deal with, because they say that's not within our pale of functioning. But I would say the totality of the election process is about both the visible challenges and the invisible challenges. And I think a lot of those who want a much more pure electoral process would look at that dimension also. And which are the aspects which gain importance there? I think there are two aspects which gain importance there. One is the whole debate in India on electoral funding, the whole debate on expenditures in elections. Now, we are extremely good in monitoring visible expenditures in elections. There are limits to how much a candidate can spend, and candidates submit reports on that. All that happens. But I'm sure Gopalaswami sir will agree with me that a lot of us believe that what is invisible is actually gigantic in proportions to what is visible. Now, that is something we have not really been able to control, which has resulted in this impression that unless you have the money power, you actually cannot be a serious candidate in the elections. And given the large number of voters you need to appeal to, in order to gain visibility, you require funding. You require finances. So is the election process in terms of being a candidate something beyond the pale of a citizen who does not, or who is not able to marshal resources? A lot of people have been talking about state funding of election, that should the state fund parties and candidates. My own response to that is it's a good idea, but I'm not too sure whether it will solve the problem, because state funding may come over and above the other invisible expenditures. My whole approach to that is different. I believe unless you control the parallel economy, you cannot control invisible expenditure, because as long as the source is there, the expenditure will continue to be there. So I think the control needs to be exercised elsewhere. The second area of a challenge, which I think is, we have much, in spite of the efforts of the Election Commission, we have not been able to ensure internal democracy in our political parties. See, the fact that political parties are top down in terms of their planning, in terms of their decision making, I think to a certain extent creates challenges of democratic participation, where candidates for elections are chosen from above and not from below. And I think this, a lot of people believe, is a weakness, is a challenge of our democratic process. So I would say, if you're talking of challenges of the democratic process, I would see these two as important challenges. And the last challenge I would like to emphasize is, I would see this both as a challenge and as an opportunity. I think the Indian civil service has proved to be extremely independent, especially during an election time, where they come under the direct monitoring of the election commission, and therefore the government is not able to, the party in power is not able to put undue pressure on the officers who are in charge of the election, and this has strengthened our election process. Gopalaswami sir will remember in 1977, I was just entering undergraduate education. I had a 1-month break. So as a 17-year-old, I became a campaigner for the Janata Party in the 1977 election. I still remember that night when I sat outside Nirvachan Bhavan, the election commission office, and the election commission kept announcing the defeat of one candidate after the other. I still remember the announcement of the defeat of Sanjay Gandhi and Indira Gandhi. And the debate, as youngsters, we were watching the debate on how the returning officers stood firm and said, no, the result is going to be declared. We will not succumb to any pressure. That, I think, and in those, and I'm talking not of today, I'm talking of an event which happened 53 years ago, 43 years ago. So over time, I think the fact that our officialdom has been able to maintain its independence is important. The challenge for me is, of late, a few cracks have appeared in that, and I believe those cracks need to be dealt with, so that that confidence of the Indian voter in the independence of the election process is something protected, is something maintained. So these would be the challenges which I would emphasize, which would require being addressed in the days and months to come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shastri. I'll turn to Dan now, Dr. Twining, and I'll come back to Mr. Gopalaswami. I'll come back to you. I think you want to make a point. I'll come back to you. Dr. Twining, what I wanted to ask you was, you're welcome to comment on what was said earlier, but what I'd also like to ask you was that, the challenges have been mentioned, which are, by Dr. Shastri. I'd like to add another one, which is technology. We are all actually having a conversation thanks to technology today. We can have people from India, US sit together and have a conversation. But technology also creates its own challenges. And IRI actually monitors elections over 100 countries around the world. And I'm sure you've seen both the positive and the negative role that technology can play. What in your view are some of the things you think maybe India should keep an eye out for and should be concerned about with respect to technology and elections?
Yeah, thanks. This has been fascinating, Aparna. I think the issue of technology and democracy is not something that simply affects India or America. It affects us all equally as open societies. These technology tools are very powerful. Things like India's electronic voting machines are very difficult to hack. They actually improve electoral integrity and security. There are many, many excellent takeaways in terms of transparency from technology. Just to give an out-of-area example, we worked with the government of Macedonia to create an open finance portal so that every Macedonian citizen can see in real time what their government is spending money on. It's updated daily. And it's an excellent way to enhance transparency, citizen trust in leaders, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these technology tools are so decisive in terms of accountability and transparency, but we have seen, I think, particularly in the social media domain and the question of information and disinformation, how at the same time technology can amplify extremist voices. It can have all sorts of, frankly, pernicious effects on democratic practice. We've seen it in the United States. We've seen it in many, many countries. Fundamentally, civic trust is essential to democratic practice. Some of the social media conversations have the effect of mobilizing citizens against each other. And I think this is less of a problem in India, but certainly in the United States, we have seen that these platforms also create vectors for malign foreign actors to come in and attempt to influence our citizens, not necessarily to swing an election one way or another, but really to kind of radicalize and energize citizens against each other, to enhance divisions and spread fake news on hot button topics. I mean, we've seen some of this in India as well. I mean, I think more from domestic actors than from foreign actors. But I think we're all grappling with what this means for the culture of civic trust that must be part of democracy, for the integrity of democratic institutions at a time when citizens can be so polarized as they have been recently, certainly in my country. At the end of the day, you know, I still believe that technology does not lead us to a Chinese-style surveillance state where government exerts total control. It's just not human nature to want to be controlled that way. At the end of the day, I think many more people all over the world would rather live in a country like India, where they are free to express themselves, free to vote in however they choose, free to associate politically in any way they choose. That technology ultimately should enhance pluralism. But over this last period, really, it has empowered autocrats. And I think this next phase for all of us small d Democrats needs to be about really making technology work better for democracy.
Thank you so much, Dan. Mr. Gopalaswami, I'll turn to you now. And I think you want to respond to Dr. Shastri, but if you could also maybe talk a little bit about technology and how you see its impacts.
A couple of quick points about, I think Mr. Shastri is absolutely right in talking about those problems, challenges which are there. Funding, political party funding. Then the expenditure levels in elections. These are all certain issues which are dogging us very badly. But in terms of the first one, that is the funding part of it, or the funding of the elections, one must understand that that the Election Commission is not the authority to amend the law. It is the government in office which amends the law, or the political party in power along with the other political parties. And therefore, there is much which the Election Commission receives but cannot do anything about it. In fact, in the affidavit before the Supreme Court challenging this particular methodology of funding, the last one which the current government brought in, the Election Commission did say that it lacks transparency. But that was so right in the right from the beginning. In every amendment to the law in terms of funding has had this problem. It is continuing. I think many of the political parties do not believe that much transparency can be to their advantage. I really can't. The other point which the Commission can or expected to do but is unable to do, which is the fact that the expenditure monitoring, I mean, they have gone to tremendous levels to monitor expenditure. I mean, behind every candidate, there is somebody carrying a video tape recorder and recording every movement. His expenditure has to be submitted every 3 days. All this is done, still they can give the slip. So that is you must, I think, they're granted to the human ingenuity, which can overcome official, surveillance in a very big way. The Commission is battling with it. I don't want to get into the details. I mean, if sitting in the last 10 years in Chennai, formerly Madras, and watching it from the sidelines, I know what is going on the other side, and where all this transactions that take place, in which way the transaction takes place, and how that is something which the Election Commission just cannot tackle at all. I mean, it's impossible to tackle. Anyway, all said and done, that is an issue which definitely is dogging us. The fake news in the last 2 elections, 2014 onwards, the use of electronic technology, electronic messaging has caught up in a very big way, and it has the potential to disrupt. The Commission has created mechanism for it, and they have been in discussion with the service providers like Facebook and others to raise red flags immediately. In fact, I was amazed at the kind of technological arrangements which the Commission has made in terms of monitoring elections. For instance, now, unlike my time in 2009 or before, every polling booth where election is taking place can be monitored from the central office in Delhi. Thanks to technology, it's possible to find out what's going on in that polling booth. If there is any issue which is being raised, if the problem is being raised, is it smoothly going, or is there any problem being created there? So it is possible to monitor and update your records on a minute-to-minute basis. All this has been done thanks to technology. In fact, one of the issues which the Commission has always been concerned is about the migrant labor. The migrant labor which goes from one state, especially the northern states, sent many of the laborers to states in the western part of the country or southern part of the country. How to enable them to vote is something which the Commission has been concerned with. And I am told that recently they have been talking in terms of using blockchain technology. I mean, they're trying to see whether it can work. I mean, of course, I can very clearly tell you that between the time they can conceptualize this and actually it becomes a reality, it may be almost a decade. And that's what happened in terms of the electronic voting machine. It was conceived by 1977-78, but the law was passed in 1990 and the rules were passed in 1992. So it took close to a decade before, I mean, it had to convince the parliamentarians that this machine is worth having. And they took their own sweet time. They had a technical advisory committee. They had a parliamentary members advisory committee and so on and so forth. By the time all this was crossed, all this was successfully crossed, it was over a decade. So the blockchain technology also, if it is brought in, technologically it may be a solution, but whether politically it's an acceptable solution is something which needs to be seen. So one part of the arrangement is the political party's willingness to undertake the required amendments to the law. In fact, interestingly, while researching some issues about the amendments to the various laws relating to elections, I found that a large number of procedural amendments had taken place. But if you talk about substantive amendments, there were only 4 of them in a period of 70 years. Only 4 which can be attributed to the political parties' willingness to experiment. One was the EVM, one was reducing the age of so actually the political parties are far more reluctant to make any changes, and some of the far-reaching changes have come thanks to pronouncements by our Supreme Court. In fact, unseating of a person who's charged or who's convicted in a criminal case instantaneously, instead of giving him a chance to appeal and then wait until the appeal is decided, is something which the Supreme Court decided. So many of the changes have been brought in by the Supreme Court, an alert Supreme Court, an alert public. I mean, many of the PL public interest litigations which are brought before the court in order to improve the situation. That is something which is a very good institution. I mean, in Mr. Shastri's institution, there is another Shastri also who is involved in ADR and so on. So there is a very vibrant section of the population which is involved in going ahead with demands for improvement of the system. Therefore, some of it is possibly done. So technology, yes, it is an advantage, it is a disadvantage. The Commission has to be far more, effective, because, of course, it's when messages pass by the billions in matter of seconds and minutes, the action cannot be instantaneous. There will be a time lag, but even so, Commission has to be very aware of whatever mischief potential is there in fake news or news which can create social tensions, and take action. Well, they're trying to do it, but I don't know with how much of success, especially in days to come. About state funding, which I entirely agree with Shastri when he said that this could be over and above, unless you have a way of ensuring that the expenditure actually spent, every pie is recorded, every rupee is recorded. There is no point in the state also funding the elections for this thing. So for the time being, at least until such solution is found, those with political ambition but do not have a deep pocket will have to wait. And talking about that, I am reminded of what Kamala Harris said. She didn't have enough money to pursue her ambition for the presidential office. So I think the problems and the scale is different. The problems seem to be the same. So there is a long way for us to go to make it very perfect. And I keep saying that our elections are fairly free, but are they fair? Not yet fully. That's how I will look at it at this juncture.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gopalaswami. We are running a little over time, so I'm going to ask Dr. Shastri to make his comments briefly, and then I'll try and wrap it up. Thank you.
Sure. Dr. Aparna, 3 very quick points on the issue. I think Mr. Gopalaswami is perfectly right in saying that the strength of the Indian election system has been sustained because of a range of judicial pronouncements, and the judiciary in many cases supporting the election commission for what it wanted. Classic example would be the affidavits which today candidates have to file, which disclose their assets, their cases against them, and also their education. But in a minute, I'll just come to 3 points on this whole technology thing. I think this point was made by Mr. Twining very well. I think when we talk of EVMs in India, there are cases, and it has happened in Bihar also, there are cases of the losing party complaining about the electronic voting machines. And maybe that's part of politics. I would make a distinction between malfunctioning of an EVM and manipulation of an EVM. I'm one of those who believes that the manipulation of an EVM is something impossible to happen, given the ways given the various levels of checks we have brought in. Malfunctioning can always happen anywhere, and that needs to be dealt with. So I think the EVMs have to a large extent strengthened the sanctity of our election process. Last point, I think technology has been very effective, but we must pause for a moment and ask ourselves, do we constantly remind ourselves that technology is only a tool to be able to ensure a free and fair election? Sometimes what happens is, in our overzealous excitement, technology becomes an end rather than a tool. We want to implement technology for technology's sake, but asking ourselves the question that does technology result in a freer and fairer election, I think is the more important question. Finally, I think we today in India are now increasingly grappling with the fact that social media is playing an important role. Especially we have a new generation now growing up which relies on the social media. With the average age in India being 29, I think this younger generation becomes very important in terms of how they are going to intervene in the political process tomorrow. So I think the need to be able to regulate the social media is important, and that's something which I think will be closely watched in the years ahead, to be able to ensure that the social media does not derail in any way the fairness of the election process. That's something we'll have to closely watch in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Mr. Gopalaswami, Dr. Sandeep Shastri, Dr. Daniel Twining for being here today. It was an amazing discussion. Even I learned some things which I did not know earlier, and I'm sure our audience will also learn. Thank you once again, and hope all of you remain well, safe and healthy.
Thank you very much, Aparna. It's been a great experience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Thank you, Mr. Shastri.
Thank you.
Bye.